Blood trickled between the cracks of the weathered boardwalk as the moon cast long shadows through Sierra Vista, Arizona, a forgotten corner of the West where secrets gathered like tumbleweeds against abandoned storefronts. It was 1883, and Thomas Decker had seen his fair share of violence, but nothing quite prepared him for what he'd find in the narrow passage between the saloon and the town's only apothecary on this cool September night. The sound of his spurs announced his approach as he navigated the darkened alley, whiskey still warming his belly. Thomas had just won a considerable sum at cards, enough to finally buy that parcel of land outside of town he'd been eyeing for months. His good fortune, however, came to an abrupt halt when his boots splashed in something wet. Looking down, he realized with growing horror that he was standing in a pool of blood. "Hello," Thomas called out, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver on his hip. The silence that greeted him was broken only by a soft, barely audible moan from behind a stack of discarded crates. Drawing his gun, Thomas cautiously approached the sound, using the moonlight to guide his way. What he found made his blood run cold. A woman lay crumpled against the wall, her pale blue dress now darkened with crimson. One hand was pressed weakly against her side, where blood seeped between her fingers. "Madam." Thomas holstered his weapon and knelt beside her. "Can you hear me?" The woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises as deep and blue as a mountain lake. Despite her dire situation, Thomas couldn't help but notice she was beautiful, with delicate features and auburn hair that fell in loose waves around her shoulders. "Help." "Me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've got you," Thomas assured her, quickly removing his bandana and pressing it against the wound on her side. "What's your name?" "Tabitha," she managed before wincing in pain. "Tabitha Morgan. Miss Morgan, I'm Thomas Decker." "I'm going to get you to Doc Wilson. Can you stand?" She shook her head weakly. He took everything." "Who did?" Thomas asked, scanning the alley. "Don't know," she gasped. "Tall man, mask, knife." Her voice trailed off as her eyes began to close. "Stay with me, Miss Morgan," Thomas urged, gently tapping her cheek. "I need you to stay awake." Making a quick decision, he carefully gathered her in his arms, mindful of her injury. Tabitha let out a cry of pain as he lifted her, but there was no time to be gentle. If he didn't get her to Doc Wilson soon, she would bleed out right here in this filthy alley. Thomas hurried through the back streets, avoiding the main thoroughfare where drunken cowboys and gamblers might delay him with questions. Tabitha's head lolled against his chest, her breathing shallow but persistent. "Almost there," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Just hold on." Doc Wilson's small house sat at the edge of town, a single lamp burning in the window despite the late hour. Thomas kicked at the door with his boot, unable to knock with his arms full. "Doc," he called out. "Doc Wilson. Emergency." After what felt like an eternity, the door swung open to reveal a disheveled man in his 60s, gray hair standing on end and suspenders hanging loose at his sides. "Thomas." "What in tarnation?" His eyes widened as he took in the bleeding woman. "Bring her in. Quickly." Thomas carried Tabitha to the examination table in Wilson's back room, gently laying her down as the doctor hurried to gather his supplies. "What happened?" Wilson demanded, cutting away the fabric around the wound with a pair of scissors. "Found her in the alley behind the dusty rows. Stabbed. Says someone robbed her." Wilson's practiced hands worked swiftly, cleaning the wound. "She's lost a lot of blood, but the knife appears to have missed any vital organs. Lucky girl." Thomas hovered nearby, his hat clutched in his hands. "Will she make it?" Wilson glanced up at him, eyebrows raised. "Since when do you care so much about a stranger, Decker?" "You planning on collecting a reward?" Thomas frowned. That ain't fair, Doc. I couldn't just leave her there. Wilson's expression softened. No, I suppose you couldn't. He returned his attention to Tabitha. She needs stitches, clean bandages, and rest, plenty of rest. And someone to watch over her for the next day or two. I can do that, Thomas said, surprising himself with the quick offer. Wilson paused his work to give Thomas a curious look. You, the man who can't stay in one place longer than a month, the notorious drifter of Sierra Vista. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. I've been thinking of settling down. Bought that parcel of land just outside town today. Well, Wilson muttered, turning back to his patient. In any case, she can't be moved tonight. She can stay here and I'll need your help getting her settled. As they worked to stabilize Tabitha, Thomas found himself studying her face. Even pale and drawn with pain, there was something striking about her, a quiet strength that intrigued him. He wondered what her story was, what had brought her to Sierra Vista, and who would want to hurt her. Hours later, with Tabitha resting as comfortably as could be expected, Thomas sat in a chair beside her bed. Doc Wilson had retired to his own room, extracting a promise from Thomas to wake him if Tabitha's condition worsened. Thomas should have been exhausted. It was well past midnight, but sleep eluded him. Instead, he watched the gentle rise and fall of Tabitha's chest, reassuring himself with each breath that she was still fighting. "Who are you, Tabitha Morgan?" he whispered to the quiet room. "And what kind of trouble have you brought to Sierra Vista?" As if in response, Tabitha stirred slightly, her lips moving in silent words before she settled back into uneasy slumber. Thomas leaned back in his chair, determined to get some answers when she woke, and to ensure that whoever had left her for dead in that alley would pay dearly for their crime. The morning sun streamed through the small window, casting a golden glow across Tabitha's face. Thomas had dozed off in the uncomfortable wooden chair, his neck stiff and his back aching. He awakened to find a pair of deep blue eyes watching him cautiously. "You're awake," he said, straightening up. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of wild horses," Tabitha replied, her voice stronger than it had been the night before. She attempted to sit up but winced and fell back against the pillows. "Easy now," Thomas cautioned, rising to help her. "Doc says you need to rest. That knife wound was deep." Tabitha's hand moved to her bandaged side. "I remember. The alley. You carried me here," Thomas nodded. "Name's Thomas Decker. Most folks just call me Decker." "Thank you, Mr. Decker. I suspect I owe you my life." Her eyes were clearer now, assessing him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. Before Thomas could respond, Doc Wilson bustled into the room, carrying a tray with a steaming mug and fresh bandages. "Good morning, Miss Morgan. Glad to see you're still with us." "Thanks to both of you," she said. Wilson set the tray down and checked her pulse. "You're lucky. The blade missed anything vital, but you lost quite a bit of blood. Another hour in that alley and we'd be having a very different conversation. Or none at all," she added grimly. "Can you tell us what happened?" Thomas asked, leaning forward in his chair. Tabitha's face clouded. "I arrived in Sierra Vista yesterday afternoon on the stage from Tucson. I was looking for lodging at the hotel when a man approached me, offering to show me to a respectable boarding house that was cheaper than the hotel." "And you went with him?" Thomas couldn't keep the judgment from his voice. Her eyes flashed. "I'm not naive, Mr. Decker. The boarding house was visible from where we stood. It looked respectable enough. But as we walked, he suggested a shortcut through the alley." She paused, her hand unconsciously tightening on the blanket. "Once we were out of sight, he pulled a knife, demanded my money and jewelry. I gave him what little I had, but he—" Her voice faltered. "He stabbed you anyway," Thomas finished for her. She nodded. "Said I'd seen his face. He took my satchel with all my belongings and left me there." A single tear escaped, which she quickly brushed away. Everything I owned was in that bag. Doc Wilson handed her the mug of tea. Drink this. It'll help with the pain. To Thomas, he added, Sheriff Mallory should hear about this. Sounds like we've got a dangerous thief in town. I'll fetch him, Thomas offered, standing up. Miss Morgan, can you describe this man? Tabitha took a sip of tea before answering. Tall, lean, dark hair, had a scar along his jawline. His eyes were cold gray like storm clouds. Thomas nodded, committing the description to memory. I'll be back soon. Rest easy. As he walked to the sheriff's office, Thomas found himself unusually invested in finding the man who had attacked Tabitha Morgan. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, though she undeniably was, but there was something about her that called to him. A dignity in how she handled her pain, perhaps, or the way she hadn't complained despite her dire circumstances. Sheriff Walter Mallory was a gruff man in his 50s who had kept peace in Sierra Vista for nearly a decade. He looked up from his desk as Thomas entered, his bushy eyebrows rising in surprise. Decker, didn't expect to see you in here voluntarily. You finally turning yourself in for something. Thomas ignored the jab. His reputation as a drifter and occasional troublemaker was well earned, though he'd never done anything to warrant arrest. Found a woman stabbed in the alley behind the Dusty Rose last night. She's at Doc Wilson's now. Says a man robbed her and left her for dead. Mallory's expression turned serious as he listened to Thomas recount Tabitha's story and description of her attacker. Might be that drifter who came in on the stage a few days back, Mallory mused. Fella matching that description was asking odd questions about the wealthy folks in town. I'll check the stage coach registry, see if I can get a name. He reached for his hat. I'll head over to Doc's to get her official statement. Thomas nodded. I'm heading back there now. Since when are you so concerned about the welfare of strangers, Decker? Mallory asked, echoing Doc Wilson's earlier question. Just doing what any decent man would do, Thomas replied stiffly. Mallory studied him for a moment before shrugging. Well, it's a welcome change from breaking up bar fights you started. They walked in silence to Doc Wilson's house. Tabitha was sitting up in bed when they arrived, looking pale but alert. She provided her statement to Sheriff Mallory, who promised to investigate thoroughly. Miss Morgan, do you have any family or friends in the area? Mallory asked. She shook her head. No. I came to Arizona seeking work as a schoolteacher. I had a letter of introduction to the town council, but it was in my stolen satchel. We've been needing a teacher, Mallory confirmed. Old Miss Winters retired last spring, but without that letter. I have my teaching certificate, Tabitha said, reaching for a small locket around her neck. She carefully opened it to reveal a tightly folded piece of paper. I always keep it close. Thomas couldn't help but admire her foresight. That's a start, Mallory said. But you'll need somewhere to stay while you recover, and I doubt you have much money left. I don't have any, she admitted quietly. He took everything. Thomas spoke up before he could think better of it. She can stay with me. 3 pairs of eyes turned to him in surprise. I mean, he clarified quickly, I just bought the old Peterson place outside town. It's modest, but there's a spare room, and I'll be needing help setting it right. He looked at Tabitha. You'd have a safe place to recover, and I could use the assistance once you're well enough. In exchange for room and board until you get on your feet. Doc Wilson and Sheriff Mallory exchanged meaningful glances, while Tabitha regarded Thomas with a mixture of suspicion and hope. That's very generous, Mr. Decker, she said carefully, but I don't know you. And a woman alone with a man she barely knows. You'd ruin your reputation before you even established one in town, Wilson added. Thomas hadn't considered that. In his world of saloons and cattle drives, such concerns rarely arose. What if Mrs. Abernathy came out to help? She's always looking for work, and everyone respects her. Mrs. Abernathy was a widow in her 60s who took in laundry and occasionally helped with household chores for various townsfolk. Mallory nodded slowly. That might work. Mrs. Abernathy's presence would satisfy propriety. He looked at Tabitha. What do you say, Miss Morgan? It's either that or the town's charity ward, which is really just a cot in the back of the church. Tabitha considered this, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her bandage. Why are you helping me, Mr. Decker? She asked directly. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Because it's the right thing to do, he said simply. And maybe because I know what it's like to be alone with nothing. Something in his words seemed to reach her, and after a moment she nodded. Very well. I accept your offer, Mr. Decker. But only until I secure a teaching position and can afford my own lodgings. Of course, he agreed quickly. It's settled then, Doc Wilson said. Miss Morgan will need another day or two of rest here before she can be moved. That'll give you time to make your place presentable, Decker, and to arrange for Mrs. Abernathy's help. As Thomas left Doc Wilson's house to prepare his newly purchased homestead for Tabitha's arrival, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed irrevocably. He'd been a drifter for so long, never staying in one place, never allowing himself to form attachments. Now, in the span of a single night, he'd bought land and invited a woman, a complete stranger, to share his home. What in tarnation are you thinking, Decker? He muttered to himself as he rode toward his new property. But deep down, he knew exactly what had prompted his uncharacteristic behavior. There had been something in Tabitha Morgan's eyes, a determination, a resilience that called to something long dormant within him. The Peterson place was about a mile outside of Sierra Vista, nestled in a small valley with a creek running along its eastern boundary. The house itself was modest but solid, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a small parlor, and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. The previous owner had been a bachelor who died without heirs, and the property had stood vacant for nearly 6 months. Thomas dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post before approaching the house. The key felt strange in his hand. He'd never owned property before, had never had a place to truly call his own. His life had been a series of temporary accommodations, bunkhouses, boarding houses, and occasionally the open sky. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dusty interior that smelled of disuse and abandonment. Sheets covered the sparse furniture, and cobwebs decorated the corners of the ceiling. It would take work to make this place livable, especially for a woman recovering from a serious injury. Thomas spent the rest of the day cleaning, airing out the house, and making a list of supplies he would need from town. He cleared the smaller bedroom for Tabitha, putting fresh linens on the bed and sweeping away months of dust and neglect. By sunset, the house was beginning to look habitable, though there was still much to be done. The following morning, Thomas rode into town to purchase supplies and to arrange for Mrs. Abernathy's services. The older woman was delighted at the prospect of regular work and agreed to come out to the homestead daily to help care for Tabitha and assist with cooking and cleaning. Never thought I'd see the day when Thomas Decker settled down, Mrs. Abernathy commented with a knowing smile. And with a pretty young teacher, no less. It's not like that, Thomas protested. She needed help and I had the space. MMHMM, Mrs. Abernathy hummed, clearly unconvinced. Well, whatever your reasons, it's a good thing you're doing. The girl needs kindness after what she's been through. Thomas stopped by Doc Wilson's to check on Tabitha's progress. He found her sitting up in a chair by the window, color returning to her cheeks. She'd been given a simple dress to replace her bloodied clothing, and her auburn hair was neatly braided over one shoulder. "Mr. Decker," she greeted him, a small smile lifting the corners of her mouth. Dr. Wilson says I'm healing remarkably well. Glad to hear it, Thomas said, removing his hat as he entered the room. I've been getting the house ready for you. Mrs. Abernathy has agreed to come by daily to help out. That's very kind of her and you. Tabitha's blue eyes studied him curiously. I still don't understand why you're going to such trouble for me. Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with her direct gaze. Just seems like the decent thing to do. Well, I appreciate it more than I can say. She hesitated before adding, Dr. Wilson told me about your reputation in town. Thomas stiffened. Did he now? He said you're known as a drifter who never stays in one place for long, that buying land and settling down is unexpected for you. Doc talks too much, Thomas muttered. I just want to be sure I'm not imposing on plans you might have to move on, Tabitha continued. The last thing I want is to be a burden. You're not, Thomas assured her, meeting her gaze directly. Truth is, I've been thinking about putting down roots for a while now. Wandering gets lonely after a time. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of similar souls despite their different circumstances. Well then, Tabitha said softly, I look forward to seeing this homestead of yours. 2 days later, Doc Wilson declared Tabitha well enough to be moved to Thomas's house. Thomas arrived mid-morning with a borrowed wagon, the back fitted with blankets to make the journey as comfortable as possible for his injured guest. Tabitha emerged from Doc's house wearing a borrowed dress that was slightly too large for her slender frame. Her face was set in determination as Thomas helped her into the wagon, though he couldn't miss her wince of pain as she settled onto the blankets. Take it slow on those roads, Decker, Doc Wilson cautioned. Those stitches are holding well, but a rough ride could tear them open. I'll be careful, Thomas promised, climbing onto the driver's seat. Ready, Miss Morgan, Tabitha nodded, one hand pressed protectively against her bandaged side. As I'll ever be. The journey to the homestead took nearly an hour at the gentle pace Thomas set. He was acutely aware of every bump and rut in the road, glancing back frequently to ensure Tabitha was comfortable. It's beautiful out here, she commented as they approached the property. The October sun cast a warm glow over the valley, illuminating the golden grasses and the distant mountains. It is, Thomas agreed, seeing the landscape through new eyes. I never paid much attention to scenery before, always too busy getting from one place to another. And now, he glanced back at her. Now I reckon I might have time to appreciate it, Mrs. Abernathy was waiting for them, having ridden out earlier to prepare the house. She helped Tabitha inside while Thomas tended to the horses, and by the time he entered, Tabitha was settled in the small bedroom he had prepared for her. This is lovely, Tabitha said, looking around at the simple but clean room. Thank you for going to so much trouble. Weren't no trouble, Thomas replied, oddly pleased by her approval. I've made a stew for supper, Mrs. Abernathy announced. And I'll be back tomorrow morning to help Miss Morgan with her needs. For now, she should rest. Thomas nodded his agreement and followed Mrs. Abernathy out of the room, leaving Tabitha to settle in. The next few days established a routine. Mrs. Abernathy would arrive early in the morning to help Tabitha bathe and dress, then would prepare meals and handle the cleaning while Thomas worked outside, repairing fences and tending to the small barn. In the evenings, the three would share supper before Mrs. Abernathy returned to town, leaving Thomas and Tabitha to pass the evening hours in surprisingly comfortable conversation. Thomas learned that Tabitha had grown up in Boston, the daughter of a school teacher who had instilled in her a love of learning. After her parents' death from influenza 3 years earlier, she had worked as a teacher in various schools back east before deciding to seek opportunity in the Western Territories. Why Arizona? Thomas asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "I wanted an adventure," she admitted with a small smile. "And the advertisement from Sierra Vista's town council promised good wages and a chance to build something meaningful. They're planning to construct a proper schoolhouse next spring. Getting stabbed in an alley wasn't the adventure you had in mind, I'd wager." Tabitha's laugh was unexpected and delightful. "No, Mr. Decker, it certainly wasn't. You can call me Thomas, you know," he offered. "Or Decker, if you prefer. Most folks do." She considered this. "Thomas, then, and I'm Tabitha," he nodded, oddly pleased by the informal exchange. "Tabitha it is." As days turned into a week, Tabitha's strength returned gradually. She began to move about the house more freely, though her wound still pained her when she exerted herself too much. Thomas found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, admiring her quiet determination and the gentle way she had begun to add small touches to the house, making it feel more like a home than it ever had. One afternoon, Sheriff Mallory rode out to the homestead with news. Thomas was splitting wood when the sheriff arrived, and he set down his axe to greet the lawman. "Any word on the man who attacked Tabitha?" Thomas asked after they had exchanged pleasantries. "That's why I'm here," Mallory replied, dismounting. "Think we caught him trying to rob the bank in Tucson. Matches the description Miss Morgan gave us. They're holding him there until I can bring her in to identify him." Thomas frowned. "She's still recovering. Is the journey necessary?" "Afraid so. They can't hold him indefinitely without charges." Mallory glanced toward the house. "How is she doing?" "Better every day," Thomas said, "but a trip to Tucson would be hard on her." "It can't be helped. Stage leaves tomorrow morning." Thomas considered this. "I'll take her in my wagon. Be easier on her than the stage coach." Mallory raised an eyebrow. "That's a 2-day journey each way." "Then we'd best get an early start," Thomas replied firmly. Inside the house, Tabitha received the news with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I want to see him brought to justice," she told Thomas after Mallory had departed. "But I admit the thought of facing him again is unsettling." "You don't have to go alone," Thomas assured her. "I'll be with you the whole time." Her grateful smile warmed something deep inside him. "Thank you, Thomas. I don't know what I would have done without you these past days." That evening, as Mrs. Abernathy helped Tabitha pack a small bag for the journey, Thomas prepared the wagon. He added extra blankets, a canvas cover in case of rain, and enough provisions for several days on the road. They set out at dawn the following morning, with Tabitha wrapped in a warm shawl against the early chill. Mrs. Abernathy had promised to look after the homestead in their absence, feeding the chickens and ensuring nothing went amiss. The journey to Tucson was slow but steady. Thomas kept to the smoothest parts of the road whenever possible, keenly aware of Tabitha's comfort. They made camp that night in a small grove of cottonwood trees beside a creek, with Thomas insisting that Tabitha take the only bedroll while he slept under the wagon. As they sat by the campfire after a simple supper of beans and bacon, Tabitha studied Thomas with curious eyes. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "How's that?" he asked, poking at the fire with a stick. "When Dr. Wilson told me about your reputation, I imagined someone harder, less considerate." Thomas shrugged. "People see what they expect to see, easier that way." "And what do you want people to see?" The question caught him off guard. No one had ever asked him that before. "Never gave it much thought," he admitted. "Been on my own since I was 16. Learned to keep to myself, not let folks get too close." "That sounds lonely," Tabitha observed softly. "It can be," he acknowledged. "What about you? What do you want people to see when they look at you?" She considered this, her face thoughtful in the firelight. "I want them to see someone capable, independent, someone who can make a difference in their community. Is that why you became a teacher? Tabitha nodded. Education changes lives, opens doors. My father used to say that knowledge is the great equalizer, that with enough education, anyone could rise above their circumstances. Wise man. He was, she agreed, a hint of sadness crossing her features. I miss him. Both my parents. My pa died when I was 12, Thomas found himself saying. Ma followed a year later, been on my own ever since. I'm sorry, Tabitha said, reaching across the space between them to touch his arm briefly. That must have been terribly difficult. The simple gesture of compassion affected Thomas more than he cared to admit. It was a long time ago, he said gruffly. They fell into companionable silence, the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of night birds the only sounds. Eventually, Tabitha retired to her bedroll while Thomas banked the fire for the night. As he lay beneath the wagon, looking up at the stars between the wooden slats, Thomas realized that something fundamental had shifted inside him. For the first time in years, he was thinking about more than just his own survival. He was thinking about someone else's well-being, someone else's future. And surprisingly, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt right. They reached Tucson late the following afternoon. The town was considerably larger than Sierra Vista, with proper brick buildings lining the main street and a bustling commerce that spoke of prosperity. Thomas secured rooms at a modest hotel, one for Tabitha and one for himself, directly across the hall. Sheriff Mallory wired ahead, Thomas told Tabitha as they ate supper in the hotel's dining room. We're to meet him at the Tucson jailhouse tomorrow morning at 9. Tabitha nodded, though Thomas noticed her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her fork. I'm nervous, she admitted. What if it's not him? Or worse, what if it is and I have to look him in the eye again? I'll be right beside you, Thomas assured her, and whatever happens, we'll face it together. Her grateful smile made something in his chest tighten. You've become a true friend, Thomas Decker. I don't know how I can ever repay your kindness. Friend. The word should have pleased him, but Thomas was surprised to find it left him wanting more. He pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on ensuring Tabitha was comfortable and prepared for the morning's ordeal. The Tucson jailhouse was a sturdy stone building with barred windows and a heavy wooden door. Sheriff Mallory was waiting for them when they arrived, his face serious as he greeted them. Miss Morgan, how are you feeling? He asked, tipping his hat. Well enough, thank you, Tabitha replied, though the paleness of her face suggested otherwise. The prisoner is being held in a cell at the back, Mallory explained. You'll be able to view him through the door without him seeing you clearly. All you need to do is tell us if he's the man who attacked you. Tabitha nodded, unconsciously moving closer to Thomas. He placed a reassuring hand at the small of her back, careful to avoid her injury as they followed Mallory through the building. The cell block was dim and smelled of sweat and despair. Their footsteps echoed on the stone floor as they approached the last cell. Mallory gestured for Tabitha to look through the small barred window in the door. Inside, a man sat on a narrow cot, his head bowed. At Mallory's command, he looked up, revealing a lean face with dark hair and a distinctive scar along his jawline. Thomas felt Tabitha stiffen beside him. Her breath caught, and she took a half step back. It's him, she whispered. That's the man who stabbed me. Mallory nodded grimly. You're certain? Yes, Tabitha said, her voice stronger now. I'll never forget those eyes, cold as winter. That's all we needed, Mallory assured her. You don't have to face him directly or testify in court. Your identification is enough, along with the evidence they found on him, including items that match the description of what was stolen from you. Thomas guided Tabitha back outside. where the bright Arizona sun was a welcome contrast to the gloom of the jailhouse. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It's over," she said softly. "He can't hurt anyone else now." "No, he can't," Thomas agreed, studying her face. "You did well in there." "I was terrified," she admitted, "but having you beside me made it bearable." Their eyes met, and for a moment the busy street around them seemed to fade away. Thomas had a sudden, overwhelming urge to protect this woman, to ensure she never had to face such fear again. The moment was broken by Sheriff Mallory's emergence from the jailhouse. "They'll transfer him to the territorial prison tomorrow," he informed them. "He'll face charges not just for attacking you, Miss Morgan, but for 2 other robberies as well." "What about my belongings?" Tabitha asked. "They recovered some items," Mallory said. "Not everything, I'm afraid. But your teaching certificate was among them, and a small amount of money." Relief washed over Tabitha's features. "That's wonderful news. When can I retrieve them?" "They're being held as evidence, but I'll make arrangements for their return once the trial is concluded. Shouldn't be more than a few weeks." With their business in Tucson concluded, Thomas suggested they begin the journey back to Sierra Vista the following morning. "Unless you'd prefer to stay an extra day to rest," he offered. Tabitha shook her head. "I'd rather return home to your homestead, I mean," she corrected herself quickly. The slip didn't go unnoticed by Thomas, but he said nothing about it. Instead, he suggested they take advantage of being in a larger town to purchase some items that weren't readily available in Sierra Vista. They spent the afternoon browsing the shops, with Thomas insisting on buying Tabitha a few necessities to replace what had been stolen: a new brush for her hair, a shawl against the cooling autumn evenings, and a journal with a leather cover that had caught her eye in the mercantile. "You don't have to do this," she protested as he paid for the journal. "Consider it an early Christmas present," Thomas replied with a smile. "Besides, I've barely spent any of my card winnings from that night." "The night you found me," Tabitha said softly. "Luckiest hand I ever played," Thomas said without thinking. A blush colored Tabitha's cheeks at his words, and she looked away, clearly flustered. Thomas himself was surprised by his uncharacteristic sentiment, but he found he didn't regret the words. That evening, they dined at the hotel again, sharing a bottle of wine to celebrate the identification of Tabitha's attacker. The wine loosened their tongues, and their conversation flowed easily, touching on their childhoods, their dreams, and the twists of fate that had brought them together. "Do you ever wonder about destiny?" Tabitha asked, her cheeks flushed from the wine. "How do you mean? Like, if things are meant to happen a certain way, if we're meant to meet certain people at certain times in our lives?" Thomas considered this. Never been much for destiny or fate. Always figured life was what you made of it. And yet, if you hadn't won at cards that night, if you hadn't chosen that particular moment to walk down that alley, you might have been found by someone else, Thomas suggested. Tabitha shook her head. "Or not found at all." She met his gaze directly. "I believe you were meant to find me, Thomas Decker, and I'm very glad you did." The intensity of her gaze sent a warmth through Thomas that had nothing to do with the wine. "I'm glad I found you too," he admitted quietly. They returned to their respective rooms that night with a new awareness humming between them, something unspoken, but undeniably present. As Thomas lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, he found himself thinking not about the land he'd purchased or the home he was building, but about the woman across the hall and the future he suddenly found himself wanting to share with her. The journey back to Sierra Vista was more comfortable than their trip to Tucson, with Tabitha's spirits lifted by the resolution with her attacker. She sat beside Thomas on the wagon seat rather than in the back, enjoying the scenery and the companionship. They arrived home late on the second day to find Mrs. Abernathy had prepared a hot meal and aired out the house. The older woman took one look at the two of them travel-weary, but somehow lighter, and smiled knowingly. "Everything go well in Tucson?" she asked as they sat down to supper. "They caught the man who attacked me," Tabitha confirmed, "and recovered some of my belongings, including my teaching certificate." "That's wonderful news," Mrs. Abernathy exclaimed. "And speaking of good news, Sheriff Mallory stopped by yesterday. Said the town council is eager to meet with you about the teaching position as soon as you're up to it." Tabitha's face lit up with excitement. "Really? Oh, that's marvelous." Thomas forced a smile, though the news brought with it a realization. Once Tabitha secured the teaching position, she would have no reason to stay at his homestead. She would move into town, establish herself there, and their paths would naturally diverge. The thought left him unexpectedly hollow. Over the next few days, Tabitha's recovery accelerated. She began taking short walks around the property, helped with light chores despite Mrs. Abernathy's protests, and even insisted on cooking dinner one evening, a savory stew that reminded Thomas of his mother's cooking. A week after their return from Tucson, Sheriff Mallory rode out to inform Tabitha that the town council wished to meet with her the following afternoon. "They're quite eager to get the school up and running again," he explained. "Several families have moved to the area recently with school-aged children." "I'll be there," Tabitha promised, her eyes shining with anticipation. After Mallory left, Thomas found himself unusually quiet during dinner. Tabitha noticed his silence, and once Mrs. Abernathy had departed for the evening, confronted him about it. "You've barely said 2 words all evening," she observed as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Is something wrong?" Thomas shifted in his chair. "Just thinking," he said vaguely. "About?" He hesitated before admitting, "About what happens when you get the teaching job." Understanding dawned on her face. "You mean where I'll live?" Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "I've been thinking about that too," Tabitha said slowly. "The logical thing would be to find lodging in town, closer to the school." "Makes sense," Thomas agreed, though the words felt like stones in his mouth. "But—" Tabitha hesitated, then turned to face him fully. "Thomas, these past weeks with you have been unexpectedly wonderful. Despite the circumstances that brought us together, I've come to value your company, your kindness, your—" She trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. Thomas's heart quickened. "Your company's been mighty welcome too," he said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. "What I'm trying to say," Tabitha continued, "is that I'm not sure I'm ready to leave this place. Or you." The admission hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest. Thomas reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand in his. "Then don't," he said simply. Tabitha's fingers tightened around his. People would talk. A single woman living with a bachelor, even with Mrs. Abernathy's presence during the day. "Let them talk," Thomas said with sudden fierceness. "Or—" he paused, gathering his courage, "or we could give them nothing to talk about." Tabitha's eyes widened. "What are you saying, Thomas?" "I'm not good with words, Tabitha, never have been, but these weeks with you have changed something in me, made me want things I never thought I'd want." He took a deep breath. "I know it's sudden, and maybe I'm a fool for asking, but would you consider— that is, would you think about being my wife?" The question hung between them, as vast and unexplored as the Arizona sky above them. Tabitha's lips parted in surprise, and for a terrible moment, Thomas thought he'd made a grave error. But then she smiled, a radiant, joyful smile that transformed her entire face. "Are you proposing to me, Thomas Decker?" "Reckon I am," he admitted, a smile tugging at his own lips. "Doing a poor job of it, too." Tabitha laughed, the sound like music in the quiet evening. On the contrary, I think you're doing just fine. Her expression sobered slightly. But are you certain? We've known each other such a short time. Some things you just know, Thomas said with simple conviction. I know I want you in my life, Tabitha Morgan, not just as a house guest or a friend, but as my partner, my wife. Tears shimmered in Tabitha's eyes. Then yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll be your wife. Thomas stood, drawing her up with him, and with gentle reverence he cupped her face in his hands. May I kiss you? He asked softly. In answer, Tabitha rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tender, a promise of deeper passion to come, and when they finally parted, both were breathless. I never thought, Tabitha said wonderingly, that being stabbed in an alley would lead to the greatest happiness of my life. Thomas chuckled, wrapping his arms around her carefully, mindful of her still healing wound. Nor did I imagine that finding a bleeding woman would change my entire future. They stood together on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms as the stars continued their eternal dance above them. In that moment, Thomas Decker, once the quintessential drifter, knew he had finally found his home. Not in the land or the house, but in the heart of the remarkable woman who had agreed to share his life. The following day, Tabitha met with the Sierra Vista Town Council, who were impressed by her credentials and her poise. They offered her the teaching position on the spot, with classes to begin the following week in a temporary space until the new schoolhouse could be completed. There's one more thing, Tabitha said after accepting the position. I should inform you that I am engaged to be married to Thomas Decker. The council members exchanged surprised glances. Thomas's reputation in town was well known, and his recent purchase of land and apparent settling down had already caused gossip. Well, said Councilman Reynolds, the first to recover. Congratulations are in order then. When is the happy day? We haven't set a date yet, Tabitha replied, but it will be soon. As Tabitha and Thomas left the town hall, they found Sheriff Mallory waiting for them. Heard the good news about the teaching position, he said with a nod. And I understand congratulations are in order for your engagement as well. News travels fast, Thomas commented dryly. Small town, Mallory reminded him with a smile. But that's not why I'm here. Got a telegram from Tucson this morning. They've recovered most of your belongings, Miss Morgan. They're being sent over on tomorrow's stage. Tabitha's face lit up. That's wonderful news, thank you, Sheriff. Don't thank me. Thank the Tucson deputies who caught that scoundrel. Mallory tipped his hat. I wish you both happiness. As they rode back to the homestead, Tabitha leaned against Thomas's side, her head resting on his shoulder. Do you think people will accept us? She asked quietly. Does it matter? Thomas countered. Tabitha considered this. I suppose not in the grand scheme of things. But as the town's teacher, I'll need the community's respect. They'll respect you for your abilities, Thomas assured her. And as for me, well, I've never much cared what folks think. Still, Tabitha mused, it might be easier if we were married before I begin teaching, less fodder for gossip. Thomas glanced down at her, surprised. Are you suggesting we marry quickly? A blush colored her cheeks. Is that too forward of me? Thomas laughed, a deep, genuine sound that surprised even him. Tabitha Morgan, nothing about our situation has been conventional. If you want to be married by week's end, just say the word. The day after tomorrow, she decided with sudden certainty. If that's agreeable to you, Thomas's smile was answer enough. They were married 2 days later in a simple ceremony performed by Reverend Hayes in the small Sierra Vista church. Mrs. Abernathy and Doc Wilson stood as witnesses, along with Sheriff Mallory and a handful of curious townsfolk who had heard the news and couldn't resist witnessing the unlikely union. Tabitha wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes and carried wildflowers gathered from the fields around their homestead. Thomas, scrubbed clean and wearing his best shirt, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle toward him. "Never thought I'd see Thomas Decker at the altar," Doc Wilson whispered to Mrs. Abernathy as the ceremony began. "Love has a way of changing even the most determined bachelor," Mrs. Abernathy replied with a knowing smile. The vows were traditional but spoken with genuine feeling. When Reverend Hayes pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas cupped Tabitha's face gently in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to Mrs. Abernathy's eyes. The small reception was held at the town's only restaurant, with a cake provided by the baker's wife and enough food to feed twice their number of guests. As the celebration wound down, Thomas and Tabitha slipped away, eager to begin their life together in privacy. That night, as they stood on the porch of their home truly theirs now, not just his Thomas wrapped his arms around his wife and kissed her beneath the star-studded Arizona sky. "Happy?" he asked. Tabitha's answer was a kiss that left no doubt. The weeks that followed were a period of adjustment and deep joy. Tabitha began her teaching duties, quickly winning over both the children and their parents with her knowledge and gentle manner. Thomas continued improving the homestead, adding a small garden at Tabitha's request and expanding the chicken coop. Mrs. Abernathy still came by regularly, though now it was to help with household tasks rather than to serve as a chaperone. She and Tabitha had developed a warm friendship, with the older woman sharing local knowledge and homemaking skills that Tabitha's city upbringing hadn't provided. One evening in early December, as the couple sat by the fire after supper, Tabitha set aside her mending and turned to her husband with an expression that immediately caught his attention. "What is it?" he asked, setting down the harness he was repairing. "I've been meaning to tell you something," Tabitha began, her voice a mixture of nervousness and excitement. "I visited Doc Wilson yesterday after school." Thomas straightened, concern crossing his features. "Are you unwell? Is it your side?" "I noticed you wincing the other day when you reached for 'I'm not ill,'" Tabitha interrupted with a smile. "Quite the opposite, in fact." She took a deep breath. "Thomas, we're going to have a baby." The harness slipped from Thomas's suddenly nerveless fingers. "A baby." He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Tabitha nodded, watching his face anxiously. "Doc says it'll be early summer, probably June." For a moment, Thomas sat perfectly still, processing the news. Then, with a whoop of joy that startled Tabitha, he leapt to his feet and pulled her into a careful embrace. "A baby," he said again, his voice filled with wonder. "Our baby." Tabitha laughed, relief and happiness bubbling up within her. "You're pleased, then?" "Pleased." Thomas drew back to look at her. "Tabitha, there aren't words." His hand moved to rest gently on her stomach, still flat beneath her dress. "A family of our own." Tears filled Tabitha's eyes. "I know it's sooner than we might have planned." "It's perfect," Thomas assured her. "Everything about us has happened faster than most would consider proper. Why should our family be any different?" That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Thomas held Tabitha close, his hand protectively over the place where their child grew. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted softly. "A home, a wife, a child on the way. Always figured I'd die alone somewhere, another nameless drifter." Tabitha turned in his arms to face him. "And now I can't imagine any life but this one with you." He kissed her forehead. "When I found you in that alley, I thought I was saving your life. Turns out, you were saving mine." The winter passed in a flurry of preparation. Thomas added a small room to the house for the baby, working through the coldest days to ensure it would be ready in time. Tabitha continued teaching, though by spring, her growing belly was impossible to hide, and the town council began discussing her replacement for the following school year. Just temporarily, Councilman Reynolds assured her. The position will be held for you if you wish to return. Tabitha was touched by their consideration. Thank you. I'm not certain what I'll want after the baby comes, but it's good to know I have options. In April, Sheriff Mallory brought news that Tabitha's attacker had been sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison. You won't have to worry about him for a long time, he assured them. I rarely think of him anymore, Tabitha admitted. It seems like another lifetime. May brought warm weather and the final preparations for the baby's arrival. Mrs. Abernathy helped Tabitha sew tiny garments and blankets, while Thomas finished furnishing the nursery with a cradle he'd built himself and a rocking chair purchased from the mercantile. On a warm June evening, as the sun was setting over the western mountains, Tabitha went into labor. Thomas rode into town at breakneck speed to fetch Doc Wilson, returning with both the doctor and Mrs. Abernathy. The labor was long and difficult. Thomas paced outside the bedroom door, flinching at every cry of pain from his wife. Doc Wilson emerged periodically to provide updates and to fetch fresh water and linens. She's strong, Wilson assured Thomas during one such emergence, and the baby is positioned well. It's just taking time. Dawn was breaking when a different cry filled the house, the indignant wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Thomas froze mid-pace, his heart pounding. Moments later, Mrs. Abernathy appeared in the doorway, her face weary but beaming. You can come in now, Thomas. There's someone who wants to meet you. On trembling legs, Thomas entered the bedroom. Tabitha lay propped against pillows, her face pale and exhausted but glowing with an inner light as she cradled a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. Thomas, she said softly, looking up at him. Come meet your son. Throat too tight for speech, Thomas approached the bed and gazed down at the tiny red face of his child. The baby had a shock of dark hair like his own, and when he opened his eyes briefly, revealed blue depths that matched his mother's. He's perfect, Thomas managed at last, his voice choked with emotion. Would you like to hold him? Tabitha asked. With infinite care, Thomas took his son into his arms, marveling at how small and yet how complete he was. What shall we call him? Tabitha smiled. I was thinking of Daniel. After my father. Daniel Decker, Thomas tested the name. It's a fine name. As he held his son, Thomas was overcome with a fierce, protective love unlike anything he'd ever experienced. In that moment, he made a silent vow. This child would never know the loneliness he had endured. Daniel would grow up secure in the knowledge that he was loved, that he belonged, that he had a place in the world. Thank you, Thomas whispered, looking from his son to his wife. For everything. Tabitha reached out, taking his hand in hers. No, Thomas, thank you for finding me that night. For saving my life. For giving me this life. Doc Wilson and Mrs. Abernathy withdrew quietly, leaving the new family to their private joy. Outside, the sun rose fully over the Arizona landscape, bathing the homestead in golden light, a new day for a new beginning. As summer gave way to fall and fall to winter, the Decker household settled into the rhythms of family life. Daniel grew stronger each day, his personality emerging as a blend of his father's quiet determination and his mother's gentle intelligence. Tabitha decided not to return to formal teaching for the time being, though she occasionally tutored students who rode out to the homestead for extra help. Instead, she focused on raising her son and making their house truly a home. Thomas expanded their property, purchasing adjacent land when it became available and gradually building a small but profitable cattle operation. The drifter, who had once moved restlessly from place to place, found deep satisfaction in working his own land. coming home each evening to his wife and child. On the anniversary of the night Thomas had found Tabitha bleeding in the alley, they sat together on their porch after putting Daniel to bed. The autumn air was crisp, and Thomas had wrapped a blanket around their shoulders as they gazed at the stars. "A year ago today," Tabitha mused, leaning her head against her husband's shoulder. "Best night of my life," Thomas replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. Tabitha laughed softly. "Most people wouldn't consider finding a stabbed woman in an alley the best night of their life." "Most people didn't find you," Thomas pointed out. He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "Do you ever regret it? Coming west, I mean, despite what happened?" Tabitha's answer was immediate and certain. "Never, not for a moment." She squeezed his hands. "Every step of my journey led me to you, to Daniel, to this life we've built. I wouldn't change any of it." "Nor would I," Thomas agreed. "Though I still intend to make sure nothing like that ever happens to you again." "My protector," Tabitha said with a fond smile. "Always," Thomas promised, sealing the vow with a kiss. Inside their home, their son slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge even at his young age that he was cherished. Outside, the stars continued their eternal dance over the Arizona landscape, bearing witness to a love that had begun in violence but had blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. In the years that followed, the Decker family would face challenges and celebrate triumphs. They would welcome 2 more children, a daughter named Elizabeth and another son called James. Thomas would become a respected rancher known for his fair dealings and quiet generosity, while Tabitha would eventually return to teaching when the children were older, shaping the minds of a generation of Sierra Vista's youth. But through it all, they never forgot the unlikely beginning of their love story: a bleeding woman in an alley, a cowboy with a kind heart, and the second chance at life they had given each other on that fateful night in 1883. For Thomas and Tabitha Decker, what had begun as a desperate struggle for survival had transformed into a lifetime of love, family, and happiness, proving that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures if only one is brave enough to follow the path forward, hand in hand with the one they love.